Hello, everyone. I'm Paris Fox, and I'd like to welcome you to 12 O'Clock High, a podcast on business leadership with Tom Fox, hosted by Richard Lummis.
What makes a great leader? Is it genetic, or can you learn leadership skills? Join Tom Fox and Richard Lummis in this podcast, where they consider leadership from a wide variety of perspectives: academic, behavioral science, history, popular culture, the movies, and much more. You'll learn about specific tactics and strategies that you can bring to your own leadership toolkit. 12 O'Clock High is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.
In this episode of 12 O'Clock High, a podcast on business leadership, Richard Lummis and I conclude a two-part look at leadership lessons from President Woodrow Wilson. In this episode, we focus on his presidency, his illness, and his death. I know you will enjoy it.
Hello, this is Richard Lummis. I'm here with Tom Fox for another episode of 12 O'Clock High, a podcast about leadership. In these discussions, we draw what we hope are interesting examples from our own experiences, history, business, literature, and politics, to examine what constitutes good leadership and extract lessons we can use to improve our own leadership skills. Welcome back, Tom.
Thank you, Richard.
Today, we're going to continue our discussion of Woodrow Wilson, the 28th president, with his career as president and in his brief post-presidential career. Tom, we had already briefly discussed the New Freedom agenda that was the platform that he ran on in the 1912 election, but do you want to give us a few more details about it?
Sure, Richard. And this was just an explosion of, or not an explosion, a synthesis of new ideas that have been percolating in American political thought for quite some time. But just as Franklin Roosevelt had the New Deal, Wilson had the New Freedom agenda. And the New Freedom agenda really focused on several different areas that influenced American political thought literally to this day. In the last podcast, we spoke about the tariff and how the majority of U.S. revenue was generated by the tariff prior to the enactment of the personal tax code, and the graduated income tax replaced that. So we actually had a positive a force for taxation, and we had a constitutional amendment which allowed a personal income tax. So that was sort of number one. Number two, and once again, one that resonates literally to this day, is the creation of the Federal Reserve System. In a many prior podcasts, we talked about the first and second national banks of the United States, and there was no national banking system. In another podcast, we talked about the financial panic of 1907 and how this led to many in New York and other leaders in the financial industry thinking that we needed to have strong financial leadership, whether it be from the banks or from the government. But this actually had been under discussion for probably since the 1890s. And this was a key populist plank, was to have a strong Federal Reserve System that could deliver credit in the face of economic downturn. The economic downturn of the Panic of 1893, the Panic of 1907, literally farmers in wagons got together to talk about these concepts, and they were many of the populists who led to the nomination of William Jennings Bryan as far back as 1896. So these concepts had been going along, and the Federal Reserve was created the Federal Reserve System was created under Wilson, and the controlling interest was through presidential appointment to the central board, which would oversee it. But the regional banks, or the banks, held power through regional Federal Reserve banks across the country, and I think there are 12 regional banks. So that was a system, and anyone who follows economics today knows the Fed is still in the news. Next was antitrust legislation. And, of course, we had the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, but Wilson was able to bring forward additional legislation which created the Federal Trade Commission and the and the bill was the Clayton Act. And this was supported both by business and labor, to the point where Samuel Gompers, the then head of the AFL, said that the Clayton Act was labor's Magna Carta. So this was a significant piece of legislation. Both with labor and agriculture, there were significant advances by Wilson to bring labor in to have as part of the discussion. There had been several very deadly labor disputes in the western part of the United States, usually around mining and coal, particularly in Colorado. And the administration really wanted to move to give labor a bigger voice. Another key area was in immigration. And I think you and I have probably joked over, I don't know how many podcasts of the more we talk about immigration, or there is no new subject around immigration. It started in the 1820s and then in the 1840s. We had a brief respite by something called the Civil War, but then it started right back up after that. And it continued to the 1890s. And here in the Wilson administration, they actually cut back on immigration, particularly from Southern Europe. So all I can say is I'm glad my grandfather got in the 1890s. But I just either I knew and forgot or never really understood the topic of immigration has been at the forefront of American political thought, literally for the life of the country. So, and then the final point was judicial appointments. And here Wilson had 3 appointments to the Supreme Court, but I want to focus on Louis Brandeis because it's difficult for me to understand now, not so much how divisive this appointment was, but he was the first Jewish person on the Supreme Court. And what a revolution that was, and a change that was. And that I'm not sure anti-Semitism is the right word. Maybe it is. But Jews were just not allowed to that level of government at that point. He was a key advisor of Wilson, so that wasn't that he just kind of came out of the blue, but he has to be acknowledged for that. And that appointment obviously resonated for the next 20 years as Brandeis stayed on the court.
Well, I'm not sure anti-Semitism is quite right. I think nativism is closer, and it influenced a lot of Wilson's thought, much of which was not explicitly racist or anti-Semitic, but I think more nativist would be a better quote. Several times he's quoted as despising hyphenated Americans, and that we need to get rid of the hyphenated American type thing. But yeah, I think he does deserve credit for it, which is good because there are a lot of other things he gets blamed for.
So that really takes us to race relations, and you, in the prior podcast, you alluded to the revisionist views of Wilson, somewhat based upon his writings, but certainly based upon some of his actions. So I guess now would be a good time to talk about race relations in 1912, 1914, 1916, race relations perhaps today, and are we overlaying our culture today over a different time, or should we be doing that?
Well, I think to a certain extent, you need to understand the context in which the beliefs come up, but they're still quite offensive. We discussed his history of the United States and how it followed basically the lost cause narrative of the Civil War, or the War of Northern Aggression, and then he did in his writings describe the KKK in quite favorable terms. He wrote about Reconstruction placing Southern whites under the intolerable burden of government sustained by the votes of ignorant Negroes. He said that the Klan was organized to protect the South from some of the ugliest hazards of a time of revolution. Famously, he screened D.W. Griffith's film, The Birth of a Nation, with its, don't know how many of you have seen it, but the racial stereotypes are astonishing. And then one thing that I think surprised both him and the Southerners in his cabinet was how integrated the federal workforce was. Grant, of course, started the integration of the federal workforce, and at the turn of the century, something like 10% of the federal workforce was African American. And Washington, D.C. was relatively unsegregated, although I think they still had significant segregation. But among other things, Wilson allowed his cabinet members to resegregate the federal government in their departments if they chose to. Some people use this to cast the blame on the cabinet members and say that Wilson was not really responsible for resegregating the federal government. But I think it's pretty clear that he favored it. At one point, he threw out W.E.B. Du Bois from his office, and a transcript of the meeting reveals that he'd argued that segregation is not humiliating, but a benefit and ought to be so regarded by you gentlemen. So I think this is definitely one of the major stains on his career. Famously, of course, in his first term, when he was running for re-election, his slogan was that he kept us out of war. His career in foreign affairs, he was one of those presidents who had no interest in it or experience in it before he was elected. He favored American intervention under the Monroe Doctrine. They occupied the Dominican Republic, invaded Haiti, Cuba, Panama, and Honduras. Just sort of routine stuff. And then, of course, you have the Mexican Revolution, where Pershing and U.S. forces were sent into northern Mexico. We also occupied the Mexican city of Veracuz. People like to forget about that one too. But he did attempt to remain neutral in World War I. He offered to mediate the conflict, but of course the Europeans were not interested in it at that point. He claimed to be neutral, but of course the United States financed the Allied powers much more, and trade with Germany was blocked by the British blockade. So effectively, we got involved in and favored the Allies. And that's one of the reasons that the Germans launched unrestricted submarine warfare, and which, of course, eventually led us into war. But so that was one of his major themes for re-election was on foreign affairs. So do you want to talk about that election?
In the prior podcast, I spoke about the Wilson biographical movie, which came out in the 1940s. It heavily influenced my view of Wilson up until the time I started studying him a little bit more in depth. And a key part of that was this election and that phrase, he kept us out of war. And what struck me about the movie was his ambivalence about the Democratic Party using that phrase, because in the movie, he seemed to think we were going to go to war at some point. I'm not sure that was historically accurate, but perhaps there's something to that. And I've always wondered if he believed that he kept us out of war, was he being disingenuous to the American people, and particularly the American farm boys who went to Europe? And if he really did believe that, was it an incredible level of naivete to think that the United States could stay out of a war, that war, certainly by late 1915 and early into 1916 during the election campaign? And I don't know the answer to either one of those, but that part of that movie always struck me. And in rereading and researching for this podcast, it brought that up again. The Republicans nominated Charles Evans Hughes as their candidate, hoping to unite both the progressive and mainstream wings of the GOP party. What I had not fully appreciated, Richard, was how contested the election was, and that Wilson did not concede, although he was behind for several days until Western states came in. Given the transportation and communication of the era, perhaps not too surprising. Nevertheless, I was not aware of that. I don't think that really has any precedent for what we've gone through in the past year, but here we have an example of a contested election and election swinging. Perhaps there was cemetery voting, perhaps not. But
well, the California vote was decided by less than 4,000 votes. So there are definitely some similarities. And as you pointed out, it took several days.
So he's reelected, and then sort of all hell breaks loose. You want to take us maybe towards the move towards war and the declaration?
They had initially started with unrestricted submarine warfare. Then they limited it in an attempt to keep the United States neutral. But then they reinitiated it in January of 1917 as part of their last-ditch effort, basically, to break the Allies prior to U.S. entrance, if that were to happen. The Zimmerman telegram apparently was the straw that broke the camel's back, proverbially, but that was, which was fascinating because it was a secret diplomatic cable that Germany was attempting to get Mexico to declare war on the United States if the United States joined in World War I, in exchange for which they would get the southwestern United States back after the German victory. The way it came into our hands was apparently through British Secret Service, because all of the submarine cables at the time went through London. And so the British, of course, tapped them. And the Germans didn't really think about that, which kind of remarkable, but one of those things. But I think the combination indicated that Germany basically lost the public relations war at that point. And so the U.S. went ahead and declared war in April of 1917 with a strong bipartisan majority.
I wanted to maybe explore the Germany's decision and their decision-making calculus to re-engage in unrestricted submarine warfare. Do you really think that they actually made a decision that they could limit or damage the United Kingdom and the Allies specifically before the United States could ramp up and make a war effort? Was the German High Command that forward-thinking?
Part of the decision, of course, was practical. The British were getting much better with the destroyer system, and they were using disguised or warships disguised as merchant marine vessels to sink submarines. So part of it was simply a tactical calculus that they were losing too many submarines the other way, and the submarines could no longer surface and all that stuff. So yeah, I think that's probably a fair point, that the German High Command made a lot of really poor decisions throughout the war, and this was likely just one of a series.
And then the other thing around the Zimmerman telegram, you're absolutely correct that the Brits tapped the cable, but I guess a couple of other points maybe three other points I wanted to raise. Number one, they weren't sending uncoded messages. That the British had found or discovered a German naval code book in Iran and had stolen it and sent it back to London, not knowing its value or how it would be used. And so that's how they were able to break the code. But it wasn't simply that they decoded the message. They had to get the physical telegram to prove to the United States. And after the telegram got to Mexico, it was stolen and presented to the United States. That I know it was stolen, but I don't know any more of the story than that. But the other thing, though, Richard, was what I had really not appreciated the enmity between the United States and Mexico at that point, where Germany thought that Mexico would be even interested. I certainly knew about Pancho Villa, the raid into Lincoln, New Mexico, or not Lincoln, but into New Mexico, and the attack or the incursion by U.S. troops into try to punish Mexico for that. But it was much broader than that. And the Veracuz invasion, I think, was as bad a public relations stain between Mexico and the U.S. as anything else. And so Mexico could plausibly have been poised to accept those sorts of conditions, or at least in the Germans' minds, because of the just terrible relations between the United States and Mexico at that point in time.
The situation in Mexico was rather fluid. Carranza, I think, was president at the time. But, there were still a number of factions. But I think the Veracruz invasion and occupation was probably the worst. I think the chase of Pancho Villa was almost a non-event as far as Mexico City was concerned, but the loss of the port of Veracruz was something that was quite serious.
So that takes us to America comes into the war. And the American Army at that time was a professional army, but quite small. They had to gear up with a selective service program and volunteers, train the Army and get them to Europe, which took probably a good year, maybe 15 or even 18 months, so that the bulk of the American troops did not start arriving until the summer of 1918 and maybe even until October of 1918. And the war, of course, ended November 11, 1918. So I'm not sure America turned the tide, but I think perhaps Germany saw that they couldn't staunch the flow of American troops, and it was going that way. The other thing, though, was Wilson put on a quite aggressive publicity campaign during the war itself to indicate that he wanted some sort of fair peace. It was built around the 14 points. One of those points, of course, was the League of Nations that we'll talk about separately. The other point was that resonated as much was self-determination. And he promised self-determination for the peoples of Europe. And this gave great comfort, I think, to the Germans, who I think even when they surrendered, said their surrender was based upon the 14 points. And so what's always struck me about this was, I'm not sure it's the naive U.S. foreign policy view. I don't know if it is a global view that kind of globalism at its earliest promotion, but it was a view that was not widely accepted literally anywhere else other than perhaps Woodrow Wilson and Colonel Edward House's mind. So this led to the peace, and then this led to Versailles and the League of Nations. And I think we both see a lot of leadership failures at this point. So you want to talk a little bit about Versailles and the League of Nations?
Yeah, I also want to address one of the other 14 points, which was the freedom of navigation, which I think was one of the key reasons that Germany entered into the armistice originally. They were starving because of the blockade by the British, and they assumed that after the armistice, the British blockade would be eased. The British refused, and Wilson didn't press them on it. And the Germans, of course, were outraged. I think there was always the view in Europe that the 14 points represented American moralism and idealism and hypocrisy. And when Wilson started trading some of them off immediately, I think that only made it worse. The other problem Wilson had so many leadership failures here. It's remarkable. Basically, he wanted to handle all of the negotiations himself, dealing with Clemenceau and Lord George, and he was just over his head in negotiating with those two. In addition, he was so focused on the 14 points that once they had agreed, sure, we'll base this on the 14 points, and we'll vote for League of Nations, then he had no leverage to argue. And basically, one of the books said that once they'd paid his price, now he had to pay theirs. And the result was the Peace of Versailles, which was just excessively punitive. I think part of what drove this was Wilson was almost certainly the most popular man in the world at this point. He arrived in France and was greeted by rapturous crowds and was treated as the savior of civilization. And I think it may well have gone to his head a bit. And I think we also have to question his physical health at this point too. The strain definitely caused a stroke later on, but he may well have been suffering from a series of strokes or certainly decreased blood supply to the brain at this point. And that may well have affected his decision making. And in the absence of a strong group of delegates to help him out, I think that only exacerbated the problem.
So there were several leadership points around the war and, more importantly, the peace. And you hit on the last one, or one of them, in your last remarks, Richard, where that's health. And health is a critical leadership issue. We talked about that in a prior podcast. It's certainly going to become more prominent. But diminished capacity, we may see that again under Franklin Roosevelt. We get to his series. But that's a critical issue. I've always wondered, was the failure of the peace inevitable because World War I was so catastrophic and, more importantly, so different than any other war which preceded at least since ancient times? This was total war. This was war against civilians. This was a mechanized war. This was a war of casualties at a scale at that point was unknown. And it was a long 4-year slog. And was it simply inevitable that the participants were going to...
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I hope you enjoyed this episode of 12 O'Clock High, a podcast on business leadership.
They could.
Also, check out the article
the casualty rate was so
podcast
high,
is based upon in the show notes.
Square inch of
Please join us again for our next episode where Richard Lummis and I will take another look at leadership. 12 O'Clock High, a podcast on business leadership, is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network and a proud member of C-Suite Radio.
Of a peace which was not punitive?
The Germans deliberately destroyed everything in northern France as they retreated in the final offensive in 1918. And that justifiably enraged the French. In addition, I think many historians feel that the failure to utterly destroy the German army and occupy Berlin was an error. I'm not sure that was ever a feasible goal, given the bloodletting that had gone on. Certainly the only army capable of doing it at the time was the American one. And, when you read histories of the period, the political power of German Americans at the time was not insignificant. And I'm not at all sure that it was ever a realistic option. But I think the fact the war sort of petered out with an armistice meant that Germany would argue that they were not defeated in the field subsequently. And I think that was one of the huge mistakes. There are a couple of other things about the war that and Wilson's role in it that I'd like to touch on, which were his creation of a propaganda office, called the Committee on Public Information. The federal government budget went from $1 billion in 1916 to $19 billion in 3 years. The government basically took over manufacturing. They introduced daylight savings time and rationed fuel supplies. I think we see here Wilson's love with the strong executive, and that he just saw an opportunity and grabbed it with both hands. And then finally, one of the things that I think is another stain on his record were the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918, which essentially criminalized political dissent in the United States. Eugene Debs, the former presidential candidate who protested against the draft, was jailed for sedition for a number of years. So basically, all anti-war groups were targeted, and many of them were in prison.
So we achieved peace. The Germans signed the Treaty of Versailles, and Wilson returns to the United States. And he has to try and sell the League of Nations to a probably at that point a reluctant Congress. I don't think they were in open revolt against him yet. But this is where either health issues, prickliness, or other character traits, or perhaps a combination of all, I thought really led directly to his downfall. As on the prickly side, he refused all entreaties. He had not included congressional representatives as part of his delegation. He had certainly not included people across the aisle as part of a bipartisan team. I think by this point he had jettisoned Colonel House, one of his top fixers, as a key advisor, and basically wanted to dictate to the U.S. Congress the terms of the peace treaty. This is not the first appearance of Henry Cabot Lodge in the life of Woodrow Wilson, and I hope someone has or someone will write a book about the intersections of them from basically their college days forward, because one of the early papers Wilson wrote at Princeton as an undergraduate was edited by Henry Cabot Lodge, who was then a senator from Massachusetts in 1918. And I don't think Lodge was completely against the treaty when Wilson returned, but shortly thereafter, he led the fight against it. And here we saw great and substantive leadership failures by Wilson. That, of course, led to a barnstorming, essentially whistle-stop tour, where he tried to use the bully pulpit to drum up support for his treaty. And this is where the final health calamity, or the next health calamity perhaps, where he was completely incapacitated by a stroke. But do you think, Richard, that there was even the possibility the league could have been approved, or one, if Wilson had handled it differently, or two, was in his character and at that point in his life, he couldn't handle it differently?
I think the question of whether the treaty could have ever been approved is an open one. Lodge was, as you pointed out, not totally against it at the beginning, but on the other hand, the charter of the league, as originally written, appeared to take the decision to go to war away from the U.S. Congress, and that was a non-starter. Wilson was one of his less attractive characteristics was his deliberate evasions and vagueness about things, which in this case, he continually tried to slide past the issue of sovereignty and whether the United States would actually be required to go to war on behalf of the League if the League voted to use military force. Without the use of military force and an international army, the League sort of disintegrated into an idealistic debating club. And Wilson knew that, but he also knew that if he tried to create the system that he really wanted, Congress would never go along. The other things we see in this fight were Wilson's contempt for his opponents and his belief that anyone who opposed him was not just mistaken but evil. We also see a level of secrecy and verging on paranoia. I think some of this is due to his health. Some of this is due to the people around him. His first wife had died in 1914, and he remarried in 1915, I believe, a woman named Edith Galt, who was very protective of him. In addition, his chief of staff and personal secretary was a man named Joseph Tumulty. And together with his physician, Dr. Grayson, they basically formed a group that accepted no advice from others. And of course, when you're trying to make a negotiation with a group of people as prickly as U.S. senators tend to be, then I think this closed group was a terrible miscalculation. But was it ever an option for him to reach out to the other side? We've certainly seen no evidence of that at any earlier point in his career.
So, Richard, he has a massive stroke and is incapacitated. Where does that kind of lead us to for the rest of his presidency?
Well, depending on who you believe, basically Edith Wilson has been described as the first female president of the United States. With Grayson and Tumulty, and of course with Wilson's active help, they deliberately concealed the extent of his illness and his incapacity and the fact that he was nearly blind. But basically it just eliminated his ability to do much of anything for the remainder of his term. Oddly enough, he after his term ended, he appears to have wanted to run for president again, which is just delusional given the state of his health, and an indication to me that his mental incapacity was quite severe.
So we've talked a lot about some of the leadership lessons from Wilson. And for the business leader who might be listening to this podcast, I wonder if we might maybe conclude with how Wilson or studying Wilson can provide some lessons learned. The tumultuousness of his times, I don't think can be discounted. Even in the U.S. domestic sphere in his first 2 years or first couple of 3 years of his first term, they got a lot done and lots of reforms. But I think he will always be the ghost of Versailles, always cast long over him. He now the racial component of his life has much come to the fore, and even at Princeton, he is not as honored as he once was. I guess, Richard, the health as a critical leadership issue is the one key lesson I had not thought of before, as much as I do now, really because his health issues started long before his presidency in a very dramatic manner that I was not aware of, and that it really changed his personality way back at Princeton. So that those sorts of things matter much more. Your analysis of his post-Versailles time where he abandoned having a wider or even some circle of advisors, Colonel House being the most prominent, to basically have a group of yes men did not serve him at all. And I think that tells us that leaders must have people certainly they can trust, but people that they allow to tell them the truth. The other thing, though, that struck me, if I look back to his early career, and we saw this more prominently with Theodore Roosevelt, was Wilson was a voracious learner. He did write, he did communicate, he gave wonderful lectures when he was a professor at Princeton, but the act of studying and writing books demonstrates to me just a level of curiosity that I think served him certainly into his presidency of Princeton and beyond. Perhaps he is the Peter Principle, at least after the entry into the war. But once again, we see this level of curiosity of a president who probably is not one of the greatest ones, but certainly is seen as above average.
Well, I think that will depend on greatest. He's certainly one of the most consequential. The U.S. entry into World War I and and especially the financial aid that the United States gave the Allies, and of course subsequently demanded that they pay it all back, which basically bankrupted Great Britain, although they didn't realize it for another 30 years. But he really, in many ways, the invasion of Mexico poisoned relations with Mexico to this day. The emphasis on morality and against militarism has been a recurring strain in American politics, but he really brought it to the forefront and made it respectable. Even Henry Kissinger believes that Wilson was Wilsonianism basically still drives American foreign policy today, which is kind of remarkable for a man who had no experience in it before he became president. His view of the strong executive followed up on Teddy Roosevelt, of course. But I think it was even more striking the extent to which he was happy to exercise presidential power outside of normal constitutional and statutory limits. So I think he's dislikable in many ways. His racism, if you want to call it that, is certainly one of the things that most people know about him today. And I don't think it's his most consequential flaw, but it's certainly one. So I think he, in many respects, he's one of our most consequential presidents.
Well, I think that's a great way to end this two-part podcast series on Woodrow Wilson, Richard.
Well, thank you. And I hope you all enjoyed listening, and I hope you'll join us next time for another episode of 12 O'Clock High.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I hope you enjoyed this episode of 12 O'Clock High, a podcast on business leadership. Also, check out the article that the podcast is based upon in the show notes. Please join us again for our next episode where Richard Lummis and I will take another look at leadership. 12 O'Clock High, a podcast on business leadership, is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network and a proud member of C-Suite Radio.